Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's Public Accountability meeting. Unfortunately, the Commissioner has had a slight accident this morning, so isn't able to join us directly. But we are hoping that we'll be able to keep her on the phone so that she can ask the questions that she wants to ask during the meeting. So we'll just run around the table quickly and introduce everybody. If you want to start.
Andrew Brody, Chief Fire Officer.
John Foster, Deputy Chief Fire Officer.
Fiona Kinnear, Policy and Scrutiny Officer for Julia Mulligan's Office for Fire and Rescue.
Ray Ward, Managing Director of Enable North Yorkshire.
Acting ACC, Mike Walker, Specialist Operations for North Yorkshire Police.
Hello, Lisa Winwood, Chief Constable, North Yorkshire Police.
Tom Thorpe, Policy and Scrutiny Manager for the Commissioner, and on the phone.
Sorry, Tom, Julia Mulligan, Police and Crime Commissioner.
Wonderful. So we've got one apology for today from John McFall. There we go. Sorry, my mind went blank quickly. From John McFall, who's the Unison rep. Right, minutes are up on the website as per the video from last month's meeting. So we'll move on. We've got one question from the public today. So the question is from Andy Ross and is a follow-up from a question asked in August. Nearly 3 years now and still no sign of a camera van in Beckwith Shaw. Totally unacceptable. What is today's excuse?
So thank you for your question, Mr. Ross, and I remember answering your question in August. Unfortunately, the situation in Beckwith Shaw in terms of the regulations haven't changed in that one of our safety camera team did go down to the site yesterday to have a look. There's still a 30-mile-an-hour temporary traffic measure in place, and we don't believe that a traffic regulation order has been placed on it by the council yet, which means we can't enforce it. So we're in exactly the same situation as we were in August, in that roadworks and temporary traffic regulation is not yet set for the 30 mile an hour, and therefore we can't enforce it. But we can look into that matter in terms of following up with the council.
Thank you. And Mr. Ross, the position as you just heard it. However, Julia has offered to come and visit you in Beckwith Shaw to see you and look at the situation and talk to you about it. So somebody from our office will be in touch with you shortly to try and book that in with you. So I hope that gives you an update, and please do feel free to contact the OPFCC and we can keep a link between you and the Traffic Bureau to keep you updated with progress on that. Right, in that case, we'll move straight to the thematic this month, which is collaboration between the police and fire services. So we are now a year on from the transfer of governance from the Fire and Rescue Authority to the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. And the purpose of this presentation is to have a look at the strategic progress that has been made around the collaboration between the two services and the way in which that's progressing, rather than specific tactical options. So,
okay. So from a strategic perspective, Andrew and I are going to do a double act. No doubt there will be questions along the way. So just to give an introduction to the subject, as you've said, in 2018, the Police and Crime Commissioner became the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner and took on governance of North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. There was a business case that underpinned that decision, which set out the desire to have a more holistic joined-up service in terms of community safety, an opportunity to build the relationships between the two organisations that already deliver community safety between them, but to gain that deeper collaboration opportunity through that strategic direction of travel so that we could work in partnership much more closely. So as you say, that came into being in November, and a huge amount of work on the foundations and background has taken place since that date, and we're now just moving into a phase where we're starting to see the strategic products come out of that will take us in the direction we want to go. So, we've had some integration into our Transform 2020 programme. So as you know, from policing perspective, our transformation programme commenced prior to the business case being approved. And since then, we've integrated North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service alongside that Transform 2020 programme, and Enable North Yorkshire, of which Ray is the Managing Director, has come into being. So that formally came into being at the start of April. We have reached a point where the collaboration agreement has been drafted and is due for approval. We also have a very strategic high-level estates plan now that will move forward with the more detailed opportunities for us to work more closely together from an estates fleet and logistics perspective as two organisations, and embed the ways that we work together. And indeed, people may have already seen, we now have our joint logos on the outside of our headquarters building here, with our fire and police joint headquarters branded at the building here. So we're starting to now see the visible, tangible signs of some of that strategic foundation work that's been going on in the background since November last year.
And I think, Lisa, it's true to say that we are starting to experience the benefits of working in the same office space and just hearing each other's conversations and being able to contribute to each other's services and work out how we can do things together. Some low-level stuff at the moment, but we can see that expanding as time goes on.
And there's been some joint visits between fire and police and OPFCC colleagues to look at some of the community policing and partnership arrangements that can be put in place as a result of that strategic alignment of the organisations. So moving on to what are the strengths of working in this way, and then we'll obviously walk through what some of the challenges and other opportunities might be going forward. So in terms of the strengths and what's working well so far, and bearing in mind as an organisation that's working together in a more strategic way, we're still very young as a strategically aligned organisation. So in terms of the future, there are a lot of opportunities that are still to be explored, but as I've said, the foundations are already there. So we've got a shared vision of public service. Interestingly, we would love to be able to deliver what the fire service have delivered in terms of prevention and early intervention. If we only had that magic formula that the fire service have been able to put in place of preventing fire from happening in the first place. So we've got a lot to learn in terms of that respect. But a vision that we want to keep people safe and make them feel safe in our communities, and we can do that together. The fire service have a lot of positive relationships in the public arena in terms of the safety work that they do, and if we can build upon that partnership working in our communities and share some of those skills, so therefore that vision is already embedded, and we're working towards that in terms of delivery of the more tangible outcomes. We've already shared Leadership Day, so we've had a joint Leadership Day earlier this year, and our second shared Leadership Day is taking place in December, where we're looking at both elements of the leadership of the organisation working together. We don't sit on separate tables as a police and fire service. We have intermingled teams, and we gain a lot from sharing those experiences on those days across the management layers of both organisations. Managers are working more closely at a local level, so now we've got the middle management layer of the organisation starting to work more closely. We've got some shared buildings out in the community where those relationships are built through the day-to-day working, which I think is being fostered from the fact that we've got that strategic direction from the top of the organisation, and that we're working together here at headquarters. The leadership structure in Enable is taking shape under the Managing Director as one shared leadership team. And also the work that's going on in some of the innovation and policy work in the Police and Fire and Crime Commissioner's Office that's starting to come to fruition. So we've had visits to other areas of the country where they have partnership-based working arrangements, so a multifunctional person, if you like, that can deliver a much better service, particularly in North Yorkshire, out in our rural communities, where sometimes we don't have that visibility of several public services because of demand, and therefore we can deliver a better service to the public together than we could ever deliver as an individual service on our own. However, as we've said, there's a long way to go, and as organisations, police and fire service have very different cultures, and we've come from really different backgrounds. And I think when you join forces with any organisations that have had their own cultural journey and their own history, we still need to work together to look at some of those cultural differences, because we work very differently. So for a good example of that is obviously from a police service 24/7, our arrangements are 24/7 out there on the road. And quite understandably, from a fire and rescue service perspective, your service doesn't operate like that, and that you don't have that 24/7. You have training arrangements that we don't have in policing in terms of operational delivery. So how do we look at those challenges and try and build that culture together, where we can share some of the best practice from both of our services and also avoid some of the pitfalls that we've both found in some of the cultural journeys that our organisations have been on. And I suppose diversity is a perfect opportunity.
And actually, in that response bit, that's a really good point that you make, Lisa, because firefighters have, whole-time firefighters in particular, within their remit, have a broad range of tools that they use to create those safer communities, the prevention, protection, response and resilience. And while there are a small number of specialists working in the prevention and protection field, the firefighters do the whole remit of the services that we provide to the public and aren't split down into separate teams.
Absolutely. So we've covered a little bit of the operational context that's different between our services, but also we've got, if you overlaid a map of all of the police facilities and the fire and rescue services facilities, we obviously occupy similar spaces in our communities because of the geography, response times, etc. So it's obvious that quite a lot of those locations are aligned. So why wouldn't we want to look at the opportunities to share some of our estates plans? Challenges, obviously fire stations have big holes that are called garages where their fire engines go, and obviously from a police perspective. So there are some challenges around, from a location perspective. It would make much more sense for police to move in to a fire station because of the facilities that you need, but we need to balance that with then the locations and operational needs of each of those services. So there's some of the challenges we've got.
We do, and I'm on public record saying that some of our buildings are really not fit for purpose and are not easily changeable into a joint fire and police station. So there are probably opportunities as well, but at the moment it's definitely a challenge on some of our stations.
We have completely different contractual terms and conditions as a result of coming from a different place in history, and our arrangements and where our terms and conditions have been born have come from very different backgrounds, and they're not currently aligned. So in terms of Enable, that creates a challenge for us as we take Enable forward, that there will be staff members working alongside each other, potentially on different terms and conditions, and that we need to look at some opportunities to align those terms and conditions for people who are undertaking similar roles and responsibilities. The operating structures we've already discussed really are that the way in which your service is delivered is very different in terms of the operational context of policing and fire, the nature of the jobs that some of your specialist teams do versus some of the police specialist teams. But we are already showing some opportunities to share those resources, and we have already done that from a tangible, tactical perspective on things like emergency break-ins to properties. So there are some overlaps of skills, but clearly if we want to extend some of that work, there are negotiations to be had over people's terms and conditions and contractual arrangements, and that will be a challenge.
And that's on the basis that sometimes there are things that fire do better, breaking down a door, for example, and sometimes there are things that police do better.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily looking to actually change the work that's being done, but just making sure that contribution is done in the right place at the right time.
Absolutely, by the right people. And there's some things right at the very senior levels of the organisation in terms of terms and conditions and operating structure where which also have an effect. So, for example, I'm not the employer of firefighters and fire service staff. The Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner is that employer, whereas Lisa is the employer of police officers and other police staff. So there are differences there that when we start to bring Enable into place, and who the employers of those people are, that creates some challenges which we're overcoming, but it certainly isn't as straightforward as it might be if we were both operating in the same arrangements as each other.
Absolutely. And I think the next bullet point, Andrew might want to expand on more than I, but we all have an endeavour to keep the public safe, but in different ways as a fire and police service at the moment. So if you think about some of the discussions that are going on, so we are servants of the Crown in terms of the expansion of the roles or responsibilities you might want to give a police officer, but very similar to police staff, fire terms and conditions are contracted, and therefore if you want to expand that person's job, quite rightly it's subject to a negotiation process.
Exactly.
So if we want to expand the public safety elements of some of the roles and responsibilities of people in both of our organisations, then we have to go through the correct channels in terms of negotiating those terms and conditions for those members of staff. Legislative barriers. Obviously the law is fairly set in terms of some of the regulations that sit around fire and police delivery. So if we wanted to share some of those responsibilities, we would have to look at what the current legislation says about people's roles and responsibilities that are set out in law, and look to how we overcome any of those legislative barriers that currently exist because of the different services, and we use different technology. But having said that, so do the 43 different police forces. So it's not only a challenge cross organisation, it's a challenge within national-based organisations. But if we want to share some of that service delivery that we've talked about, we need to find ways to then connect to each other's systems and deliver that in an efficient and effective way.
Would you say there are also some challenges around, whilst you're working together really, really well, of maintaining your own identities as well in terms of both individual services, so that you have your own values, and also that some of the roles such as like enforcement don't tip into firefighters' roles?
Yes, and we talk about this quite a lot in partnership working, and if I had a diagram to show you, maybe we should put it up on a slide, is a bit like a Venn diagram. So no matter which organisations we work with in partnership, there will always be that element of the circle of the Venn diagram that is uniquely that service's responsibility. Mm-hmm. So if you think about police and fire overlap, there'll always be the element of the fire service that is uniquely delivered by fire. There'll always be the unique element of law enforcement and policing, and the bit that overlaps in the middle is where we could work more closely together of delivering a more efficient and effective service, but we will always retain those unique identifiers, if you like, of those services that have that expertise and skill in those very specific areas of business.
And there are concerns raised sometimes by people in the fire and rescue service that the very high levels of satisfaction and love that the public have for the fire and rescue service might be eroded if we're seen to be working very, very closely with the police, whose role in enforcement means that some elements of society are less keen on the police. But I think that's Lisa's point. There are elements of our work which will forever remain separate, but they will shrink, because there are also elements of our work, both in the enabling services but also in the early intervention and the prevention arena and the community resilience arena, where we can definitely start to work together really closely, because they're very positive for everybody. They're very positive aspects of our work.
Yep.
And so we talked there about the challenge around, well, the fact that strategic leadership has come together, but obviously still there's currently there's a policing crime plan and a fire and rescue plan, and there's also two separate sets of values for each organisation. In terms of challenges around culture, do you still feel that it's appropriate to have separate values in terms of trying to bring culture together, or do you think that is actually beneficial in terms of maintaining the...
I think it helps to maintain our individuality as organisations, and I think if one organisation simply adopted the values of the other organisation, it would look like a usurping of power and control and all that type of thing. And actually, we would have to look at the services that we provide and the different approaches that we have to take through the enforcement of through the police and through the prevention, the protective aspects of the fire and rescue service, that the values aren't necessarily the same for delivering that type of work.
Yeah.
If you dig under the surface though, when you look at the headlines of the values, when you actually go into what do those values actually mean, there's a huge overlap in what they actually mean. in terms of behavioural, what you see in the behaviour of the people in those organisations are very similar, even though the headline values might be a different title.
Yeah.
And we all exist to help the community that we exist to serve. So in that light, the people who join our organisations are people who are keen to help those in need, those who are most vulnerable. So the values of the individuals coming into our organisations are probably very, very similar. But the actual title of the names of those values, I think, is probably worth keeping separate between the two organisations, so that when we are performance managing our own staff as well, then we can performance manage them against a values framework that they themselves have helped to develop for their own organisation.
Julia, is there anything you'd like to come in on around those challenges at this point in time?
I think it's really important that the values of an organisation are reflective of that organisation, and I don't think it would be appropriate for the police and the fire rescue services to have exactly the same values, because they are different services. You know, when it comes to Enable, I think that's also quite interesting, because my view would be that actually, you know, Enable has a very specific role in this mix as well, and actually it may have its own set of values. Doesn't mean to say that the overall sort of vision around protecting the public and keeping the public safe would be any different, but actually the qualities that you want to nurture in each organisation might be slightly different. With the same aim. So I'm relaxed about the values. I think they need to be reflective of the core business of each organisation and come from within that organisation as well.
Agreed.
Great.
Okay, so we can start to look at some of the opportunities that exist to overcome some of those challenges, which Lisa's just talked about, is ensuring, I think already exists, but the opportunity is that we both focus on the safety of the public from whichever perspective we look at that from. So the joint aim of helping people to feel safe and to be safe is something that brings us much more closely together, because we're both, the two organisations have both got the same raison d'etre for existence. We exist to help people to feel safe and be safe, and I think the more that we work together, we brand more closely in some aspects of our work, then the more that will become apparent. The physical co-location of enabling services. So in the next 2 weeks, the Fire and Rescue Service headquarters will start to migrate into a joint police and fire headquarters, and I very deliberately don't say move into police headquarters. I very deliberately say become a joint police and fire headquarters. And that's going to, on the one hand, be a difficulty because those teams won't be quite as identifiable, and it won't be possible for me, for example, to walk into the HR team at fire headquarters and just have the fire HR team there. However, I'll still have access, of course, we'll still have access to all of those teams, and the real advantage is in having them share a space is that they will begin to blur the edges, as you and I are, Lisa, simply by working in the same space. They'll identify the things that work best and the systems that work best in each organisation, and they can identify the work that can be done once to the benefit of both organisations. So that's going to be a massive advantage, having everybody in the same space. Joint working of operational staff as well. So where our enabling services staff are able to identify ways that they can work together, will so will our operational staff, you and I sitting in the same room, our senior teams, and also as more and more our fire stations and police stations become shared buildings, they will also identify ways that they can work together, particularly around prevention and protection and incident support. And a lovely example of incident support is the agreement that we are entering for the Fire and Rescue Service to be able to access the drones which are owned and operated by the police. And I think as we sit together in the same spaces, we'll identify more and more opportunities like that. And then the joint and aligned structures which will accelerate the pace. The fact that we all sit in the same room, the fact that we have a single police, fire and crime commissioner overseeing the two organisations removes some of the barriers automatically, because we're far less likely to be challenging to another organisation when we both work to the same overall lead. And I think that is already showing that we're accelerating and speeding up the rate of collaboration. I just have to look at Enable and Ray Ward over there and compare that to other parts of the country to see that we are well advanced in that. Our aims, shared workers. Lisa, you mentioned earlier on about the notion of a public service worker or a multi-agency worker. So that's looking to pick up, for example, on work that's been done in Cornwall, where they've developed tri-service officers, which is a single person jointly employed or jointly funded by police, fire and ambulance to deliver early intervention, prevention and response services within a rural community. The fact that we're in North Yorkshire, we're largely rural, means that that is a model that we're very, very interested in, because it helps to share the use of the public pound and to put it into places where historically there hadn't been the same levels of service that are provided in our more urban areas. So there are opportunities, huge opportunities around that. Sharing of intelligence and data, well, our customers tend to be the same. A vulnerable person from fire is very often a vulnerable person from crime and antisocial behaviour and other types of problems with security. So now that we're in the same space, now that we are working within similar arrangements, we should now be able to move towards sharing some of our data much more readily, so that when we identify somebody from a fire and rescue service perspective who is vulnerable, then we can share that information with the police so they can help make them safe. And that comes back to that shared worker, because in rural communities, one person can go and do that visit and make sure that that person is safe from both a police and fire perspective. Shared leadership and enabling services. We have Ray Ward in the room here. Ray has been employed as the Managing Director of Enable, and he is putting together now a leadership group, 5 people who will form his leadership board to deliver the enabling services within the organisation. And just before I came into this meeting, I was looking at the questions that we will ask in the interview for one of those heads of, and make sure that those questions include something back from applicants about how they are going to work to bring those two things together. I don't think I'm giving anything away. I think that any applicants would fully expect to be asked about how they will seek to bring together the leadership and enabling services opportunities we've got.
Can we just ask in terms of that, because obviously that it's a big move, the sharing of the enabling services. The fire portion of the staff that are kind of moving into Enable is much smaller than the portion in policing, and we're very aware that there have been concerns within both services, I guess, actually about some loss of ability in terms of actually receiving those services and having those services delivered equally. Are there proper mechanisms in place to make sure that can be resolved? Very aware, for example, at the moment that fire service don't have any data analysts at all. Are you reassured and confident that you're receiving a level of service from data analysts pulled centrally through Enable, for example, as a result of that?
The short answer, yes. It is very challenging at the moment, for example, in that data field, because we're really struggling to attract people into a data team in the fire and rescue service. But what Enable provides us is, in the short term, support to provide the data that we need to provide. And John will present our data later, and we'll, I'm sure, perhaps talk about how hard it is to get that data in at the moment. But we're managing as a result of having Enable with us. As we move forward, resilience for the fire and rescue service and capacity will improve dramatically, simply because we will have access to more people and fewer single points of failure in the event of someone being ill or sick or something like that. In terms of the mechanisms that we'll put in place, we have several groups which will look at the quality of services that we receive through Enable, and we will commission, as senior officers, Enable to deliver enabling services for us. And of course we need them to be of sufficient quality for us to be able to get our work done. But those people working within Enable will remain employees of the Fire and Rescue Authority and the Chief Constable, and they will remain within their existing employer when they move across into Enable. So there should be surety there. And from a fire and rescue service perspective, we're restructuring our corporate management board, and one of the roles in there is head of assurance. And that person will assure both the services that we deliver to myself and to the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, but will also assure the services that we receive, the commission services that we receive from Enable. So I'll have somebody working full-time, making sure that the services that we receive are appropriate and suitable for our needs. Good. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think for me, it's not about one organisation delivering a service to the other or vice versa. This is about Enable delivering a service.
Yes.
So there is an equality in that service delivery, as opposed to it being somebody delivering to somebody else. But it's a shared endeavour.
And I would anticipate that people's roles will become all the more interesting, because they won't be confined to the police service or the fire service. There will be opportunities to work on behalf of each other, and I think it'll probably enhance people's work rather than anything else. Shared training opportunities. So there in the incident command and the leadership and the service delivery areas, there are shared training opportunities, both in terms of facilities and working alongside each other using the JESIP, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Protocols. Lots of opportunities there, but then also from a learning and development perspective and that leadership development perspective, we have previously worked separately on those areas, and actually having a single learning and development manager underneath the head of people in enabling services, or that type of structure and job title, I think that will provide huge opportunities for us to be able to look more closely, because so many of those skills are shared regardless of the organisation that somebody works in any sector, let alone between two emergency services. Shared assets and estates we've already spoken about, Lisa, and certainly having a joint headquarters saves us in the Fire and Rescue Service a significant amount of money by not having to provide our own, and it brings all of the benefits that we've already spoken about, sharing fire stations, sharing other buildings. We've got our transport and logistics hub at Thirsk, which was created before the establishment of Enable and the change to the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner model. Nonetheless, we have further opportunities in there to completely continue to develop that.
Estate, I know you're working on a joint estate strategy.
Yeah.
Will that also look in the future to include other partners and agencies as well as just the two services, such as ambulance?
Well, yes, but even beyond on ambulance, and we are looking at opportunities to share with the Yorkshire Ambulance Service, but also into local authorities and other organisations as well, because if we can create hubs in communities where people can come to one place to receive services from lots of different organisations, that'd be helpful. It's made very, very difficult because of certainly from a fire perspective, I can't speak on behalf of others, but the lack of capital investment funds that we've got to update and refresh and replace our buildings are very limited. So using the existing estate limits the opportunities to do that, but where they arise, and I met recently with a chief executive council to talk, and one of the things that we spoke about was the ability to share estates and have single hubs for all community services being delivered. Service delivery, putting the public at the centre. Well, the public are at the centre of everything that we do, really. We both exist to deliver services to the public, and the more that we can join up, the more that we can share resources, the better able we are to do that, and the lower the impact is on the public, because rather than getting separate visits from the two organisations, ideally we'll be able to deliver single visits to deal with multiple issues. And I have experience of that, and there's other experience around the fire and rescue and emergency services sector nationally, where pooling workers into single teams where they learn from each other and start to do each other's jobs in the prevention and early intervention arena is tremendously successful.
Can I ask around that? So in your opportunities that you identified there on the previous slide, you're talking about outcomes and the focus on outcomes to make sure that there's a proper focus on those which are most in the benefit of the public. Obviously, the police and crime plan and the fire and rescue plan set out a very clear set of outcomes. that are public forged, if you like, through the work that went into creating them.
And the consultation.
And the consultation, exactly. I presume, therefore, that your work around looking at putting the public at the centre of your service delivery and your focus on ensuring that the outcomes that you are working towards are at the heart will very much centre around those which have been identified by the public through those documents.
Yes, I mean, it's a timely question because at the moment we're putting together, for example, this is one example of our approach toward this. In January, lots of managers and influencers from within the Fire and Rescue Service will come into a single place for a week of shared learning. That Monday morning I will set out my ambition for the service in 2025 and the philosophy that lies behind how we've got to that place, but not only the philosophy but also the other documentation and directives that we've got through things like the National Framework for Fire and Rescue Services, the Fire and Rescue Plan, our soon to start to be created integrated risk management or risk and resource model. And at the very centre of that, the very first slide that people will see me present on the Monday morning, Monday the 6th of January when we all come together, will be a slide that has a number of triangles. And the triangle at the top pointing upwards is the public. And that triangle, that shape, is all of the community and the community organisations that serve the public. The next triangle that comes down and overlaps that is the front line of the Fire and Rescue Service and all of the other public services that actually keep the public safe and secure. So that model, with me at the bottom of there, supporting all of that in the Fire and Rescue Service, is absolutely pointed towards, for example, we exist to deliver services to the public, and the services that we deliver must be the best that we can and the best value that we can provide. So that in itself places the public at the very heart of everything that we as a Fire and Rescue Service do, and I know that they sit at the heart of everything that the police and policing does as well.
Excellent.
So that's a long description, but it's just an opportunity to talk about
and
that.
just to make a pitch, I guess, for the first 4 public accountability meetings of next year, we'll be asking both services to go through how they've delivered against the priorities set out in each plan. So that will help to put that into reality.
That's helpful. Focus on prevention and early intervention. I think I've just covered that in all that I've spoken about. What we hope to achieve, improving services and tailoring them to the needs of communities and creating savings to reinvest them at the front line. So frontline services are anybody in our organisations who touch the public, who deliver services directly to them, and our aim is to maximise the amount of frontline service provision that we can provide. The tailoring them is very interesting because a broad brush approach to everybody is not appropriate. People within very urban areas have different needs to people in very rural areas, and we will continue to work to tailor our services to make sure that people get the services that they need, not that somebody else does. We've already spoken about the trial of a multi-agency worker. That's tremendously exciting, and that will place visible policing, visible Fire and Rescue Service, and visible any other partner that wants to join us in that, right into the rural communities that so often feel that they are underserved by the public service. From a selfish fire point of view, it puts somebody working full-time who can respond as an on-call firefighter and help us keep fire engines available, for example, but also during their work can be doing all of the early intervention and prevention work from a fire service and a police force and any other agency that's helping to fund them. Joint commissioning strategies, cross-organisational investment and resourcing. So we've already spoken about some of this, the joint commissioning strategy, for example, through Enable for getting our enabling services provided to support those frontline workers and teams. Cross-organisational investment, when we start to look at joint estate strategies, joint fleet strategies, joint sustainability strategies, which link into those two things, that's when we can really start to show that the public pound is being spent to the best effect, freeing up more public pounds for the front line. And resourcing decisions, so we won't be doing that in isolation. When we're thinking about how to resource a fire service, or Lisa is thinking about how to resource a police force, we won't do it in isolation, we'll do it jointly and share where we can. And longer term, the cultural changes that Lisa touched upon earlier on, that as one of the challenges, well, actually one of the opportunities and the results that we expect to see is more is closer alignment of our cultures and taking the best bits of each of the cultures to create a single culture, or as close as we can to a single culture where it's appropriate to the benefit of our staff and the people that we exist to serve.
I mean, the tailoring of services, given the geography of our county, is a real opportunity for us here, because we've both talked about the difference between rural and urban delivery of service, and we both face the same challenges and opportunities in those urban areas where you can dedicate a team to do something, but in the more rural areas where we're touching the same people and trying to keep the same communities safe, but we're doubling up on resource when actually this is what the multi-agency working is all about, is that we could deliver that more holistic service as a one-stop shop to somebody in a rural community that we currently do separately across agencies. So there's some real opportunities there for us to be more efficient in our delivery of service and keeping people safe in those areas.
And to filter sometimes the need for somebody from a specific agency to come from a long way away and travel all that way there, potentially for only one job. If that can be filtered and seen to be unnecessary, then that will help the agencies in those urban areas to not have to release staff into rural areas as often, and therefore improve the focus on urban areas as well. So these two things are very much cyclical, they rely upon each other.
That's not to say though that we would be expecting agencies to reduce any targeted interventions or specialist provision in those communities just because there is this multi-agency worker, because this multi-agency worker won't obviously be able to be a specialist in absolutely everything.
No, they won't be. But if I can provide an example for this through conversations I've had with people in health, and in fact it was in the news over the last couple of days about GP home visits. So that the requirement to provide home visits is a huge resource implication for a GP surgery, but they need to do it. But very often, from what I'm led to believe, when they get to that home visit, it's not actually a GP that person needs. So therefore that time is unnecessarily spent. If we had somebody, perhaps part funded by health, who could drop in on older or more vulnerable people who are asking for those services to see if a GP visit is what they need or if it's something else, then that, for example, would be the filter between the call to the GP and the GP actually responding. But we would always have to be very careful that they were receiving the services that they needed, and where a GP visit is needed, that is what is provided.
And I guess also the point there is that it's not just about retrospectively understanding vulnerability, it's about proactively taking a strength-based approach to, I mean, fingers crossed, if this were to work effectively, I guess what you're saying is that the need for that GP visit in the first place would be removed because the fact that that person was potentially living in a slightly colder home, or the fact that there wasn't enough food in the house or whatever, may well have been addressed upstream.
Exactly that. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that we're going to start replacing GPs. And please, anybody who's watching or reporting in this, don't for 1 minute think that is what I'm suggesting. It's simply in large rural areas, the travel time and the ability to provide full-time resource in a rural area is more challenging. And where we can share resources between organisations to put full-time resources into those areas to cover the work of lots of those agencies, but bearing in mind that the specialist in each of those agencies can still come in. It's that philosophy, that principle that I think we ought to be aiming toward. So moving on, reduce estates costs, we've talked about. I think there are 107 police and fire buildings across North Yorkshire, and I would hazard a guess, I know that many towns have both got a police station and a fire station, and never the twain shall meet, but the twain shall meet more and more in future as we co-locate, and if we can co-locate with other organisations and services, then as I spoke about earlier, that creates really effective hubs in those communities.
And they're often next door to each other at the moment in terms of location.
Yeah, so literally next door to each other. Yeah, but the capital costs of investing in those buildings or rebuilding them is significant. Physical co-location. not just being in the same building, but really working together without physical barriers. And that's happening in our headquarters now, in our joint headquarters. People sitting cheek by jowl in the same part of an office with no barrier between them at all. And that's already proving to be fruitful. A community safety estate and a single estate strategy. We discussed in the executive board this morning the estates framework, and that's starting to really look at how we can bring those two things together and work more effectively. But I'd be repeating myself if I went into it in more detail. Integrated specialist training we touched upon before. We have got in the fire service some fantastic training facilities for firefighters to train in, and in actual fact they are very suitable for police as well. And there was a television programme on a couple of nights ago which showed counter-terrorism police officers training in a fire and rescue service facility in another part of the country. Well, there's no point in recreating things when we can share those facilities and work closely together. Joint structure for enabling services we've already spoken about, and that leadership board is being put into place as we speak, and Enable will provide us with shared support services for both organisations.
Okay, so just to make sure that the public have a full understanding of what we're expecting to achieve in the next 12 months, as it says up there, are we saying that we'll have a single estate strategy within that time, and we will have achieved a significant reduced estate costs and reduction in the number of buildings within that time frame? Is that the ambition?
Right, so the single estate strategy within 12 months is absolutely realistic, and it will be in place. The notion that in the next 12 months we would have co-located all of our buildings, that sits in the and beyond section of the title of this slide. Where we can, so for example, speaking to some firefighters at Harrogate the other day, they have cleared a space in their fire station for the police to co-locate officers in that space. They're waiting for them. They've got ahead of the game and cleared the space before the legal agreement is in place for that to happen. Some of those things will happen within 12 months, but the long-term, real single buildings co-location programme will take years and potentially even decades to achieve.
Okay, so that's just important for the kind of managing of public expectation. In terms of the integrated specialist training, what's the kind of expectation?
So there's already work ongoing in relation to so command training, for example, because you've got fantastic command training facilities. We've explored some of the opportunities there. We've explored opportunities that are ongoing really in terms of driver training. We've looked at there's some regulations, and that is back to the legislative challenges that we looked at earlier, because some of the legislation around driver training qualifications comes into play there. So we are exploring some of those more specialist areas of training that we can put in place, and some of those barriers will be able to be overcome in the next 12 months. So we should see some tangible outcomes to some of those training opportunities. And certainly there's a big piece of work going on in terms of our learning and development structures and opportunities for more technical ways of training people. So there'll be shared subjects that are relevant to both organisations, where we can use technology to potentially train a wider pool of people across the two organisations, rather than people going to individual classrooms in each of their own organisations to receive that input.
The good thing, Tom, is that the relationships with training managers in both organisations have been ongoing for over 12 months.
Yeah.
When they've faced these problems at the front line and thought there must be a better way of dealing with this, we know what's coming over the hill in relation to fire service, etc. Let's start having those conversations. So the relationships have already been built, which is good.
Julia, is there anything you'd like to come on in terms of those aims and results at this point in time?
No, that's fine. The next thing on the estates is really that detailed piece of work on the estates. I do share Andrew's concerns around capital. Obviously, the police has more capital, but obviously that has to benefit the police. We can't just spend police capital on fire buildings. The police have to get a proper return for them on that. So there are some complexities around this, because one service can't subsidise the other, quite rightly, but we do need to have a look at that wider estates piece.
And that slide that's up there now just shows the different functions that currently exist within both North Yorkshire Police and North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and the functions that are moving and have moved into Enable, so that they can be working alongside each other under a single leadership structure. And that leaves us with questions.
I think we've essentially covered everything on the questions front, unless you have anything else, Fiona.
No.
Julia?
No.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's very exciting times, isn't it? And just to let the public know, we are finalising at the moment the compilation of a full report 1 year on from the transfer of fire governance, looking at everything that has happened, including the full reflection on the transfer and lessons learned from that. And that will be published early next week, so that will be available from the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner's website on Monday or Tuesday. So that will hopefully provide a comprehensive summary from there. So thank you very much. Okay, on that note then, we will move on to the performance updates, starting with the fire service, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So this covers our monthly performance summary and it covers the month of October. I will just say at the beginning, and we touched on it in the previous presentation, that we have got some issues with our data. It's largely due to staffing issues at the moment and capacity to actually extract the data out. So some of the information which would normally covered within this report is missing this time, but I can give verbal updates on it. And we aim to try and iron out some of these issues, certainly by January, and certainly by working more closely with our Enable partners now. So the incident overview shows that we had 523 incidents in October, and that is a decrease from 638 the previous month. And in this slide, it's interesting to note that our false alarms have come down quite a bit over the last 3 months, and that still continues. That trend continues. That's really good news. Special services increased slightly from 160 to 172 in the month of October, but our fires fell from 150 in September to 100 in October. And like I say, false alarms, they fell from 318 in September down to 251, so that's a good trend that continues to fall, and that's largely due to the work that's now going on in districts to try and improve the situation with the false alarms. We just have to put an air of caution on that one, because a lot of these accommodations can be due to education establishments, for example universities, some private schools, and of course some of that could be reflected because of the previous holiday period, so we'll just keep an eye on that one, but let's hope that the trend continues going forward. The other point to note on this slide is that as in previous public accountability meetings, our demand still remains within that 8 o'clock in the morning to the 8 o'clock in the evening category, and then overnight it drops right off, and this is an area that we need to really focus on, because that's when generally our appliance availability is low due to our on-call staffing issues. Something we need to keep focused on, and we'll do so going forward.
There seems to be quite a significant number of incidents happening at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, certainly that seems to be the time when all the false alarms go off in the county.
Yeah, and again, these types of trends, at that time of a night, if it is false alarms, which is larger incident capacity, it can be for a number of reasons really, and again in care establishments, which tends to be where a lot of these come from, hospitals particularly, it could be due to certain practices there, but it's certainly something we are now working heavily with the local occupiers of those premises.
It's probably worth noting in that sometimes we have arrangements, or the premises will have an arrangement where if the alarm goes off, there is a time built in for them to go investigate it themselves. And if it's a false alarm, then to cancel a signal being sent to the fire and rescue service. So at 11 o'clock at night, there's probably fewer of those places that are occupied, compared to 11 o'clock in the morning.
That's fair enough.
That might be one of
Yeah.
the impacts.
Going forward then onto the slide which covers our fire overview. This draws in the types of incident that we've got, and certainly in October there you will notice that we've had an increase compared to September from 1% up to 10% on chimney fires, and that I would expect will be a pattern we see over the winter months now as people start lighting their fires and using their stoves, etc., keep them warm over the winter period. And I think what we would urge here is that any listeners watching, and you do have an open fire or a coal fire, please visit our website and take on board our prevention advice there, and certainly make sure that you've got any open fires are protected with a fire guard, and make sure that they do have the chimney swept regularly, and that includes both open fires and wood burning style stoves. So please urge people, if they are in that, if they have that type of heating appliance, please take our advice on that. The other point to note this month is that sadly we have had one fire death in October. I say fire death, we're still waiting the outcome to confirm whether it was a fire death that actually caused this or not. We always hold a fire fatality review meeting after each incident. We held that last week to understand what we can actually learn from those types of incidents, and what we drew from this particular case was some learning about how we may engage more closely with our partners. Still early days in terms of the investigation, but we've drawn quite a lot of learning from that incident, whereby we will go and engage more closely with some of the partners out there, particularly cross-border style problems have emerged from this one, which we need to look more closely into. And one thing I would say is, I would like to pass our condolences to any relatives who maybe was listening to that particular incident.
Sorry, and Julie, you wanted to come in specifically on this matter?
Yes, I did. So it is to pick up really, John, on the issue of a sort of adult safeguarding, and people with particular vulnerabilities, and making sure that responsibilities are clear between the different agencies. So I was, for example, in Harrogate recently and was party to a conversation between the local council and fire and rescue services around a particular individual that was a hoarder, and there seemed to be a bit of pushing the problem around between the two of them. Not in and people recognise that wasn't in the interest of the individual, but it does just worry me when it's not clear who should be responsible for what, and actually making sure that it's clear that the fire and rescue service have a particular role in terms of sort of signposting to other services, but also making sure then that those other services do pick up the actions that they need to, so that those people are kept safe.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, and one which is quite a difficult one at times to engage with the right people. Invariably, we come across these people. Tends to happen during the evening, out of hours, when we don't have access to the correct partners that we would like to. So yeah, it's something very much that we need to work with our partner agencies on. I think going back to the previous presentation, an area here which may come in and help out is when we come on to our shared workers, and when we introduce the multi-service role into the both organisations and beyond. That is where we hopefully will start to see some real true benefits by having a multi-service officer role who has access and can be that point of contact into many other partner agencies. I think that's where some real true benefits will be realised for this type of vulnerability.
I think adding to that, that will really help in the rural areas. Within the urban areas, the philosophy, the principles that we will start to apply through what we call a maximising capacity programme affecting our whole time fire crews on stations will be that they will be accountable and responsible for the safety of their community. They'll own the safety of their community, but they'll have freedom and flexibility in determining what work they do to create that safety. And one of the tools that they'll be heavily encouraged to engage in is around working with other organisations, working in partnership. But where the firefighters find somebody who is vulnerable, they will keep hold of that person, working with and referring to other agencies, but not simply letting go of them and allowing the other agency to take over. So I think both rural and urban communities will get the advantage of both multi-agency officers and just a freshened approach in the fire and rescue service where we keep hold that ownership of vulnerability.
So I mean, it was really interesting, this particular conversation, that was that, you know, there was a sort of suggestion that the fire rescue service should be going into this home and, you know, cutting the plugs off various appliances so that the individual couldn't use them because they represented a risk. But obviously that's not something that the fire rescue service can do. And actually, you know, the wider question there is, you know, how, you know, when you've got somebody who is vulnerable and clearly has mental health issues, you know, how do we make sure that person, you know, gets the support that they need, and that the risks, not just fire risks, but for example, you know, potential victim of fraud or scams, you know, are mitigated in a joined up way. And it was just a really good example of how I think people were trying to do the right thing, but were struggling with the system. Yeah,
and I agree. And I don't suggest for any moment, and I know that you're not suggesting it, Julie, that firefighters would start to become that psychological support for people who are very vulnerable and suffer mental health illnesses, but they would work very closely alongside people who have got those skills, and the firefighters would use their skills in terms of the physical safety of a place, working alongside the psychological support that might be available to somebody to help them overcome some of the dangerous behaviours that they show.
I mean, one of the things that I was wondering, and I haven't mooted this before, so forgive me though. Obviously, we do have a mental health triage service in the force control room, and I do wonder whether vulnerability of this type could actually, whether there's an opportunity to try and sort of extend that around this. So I don't know. That's maybe something just for me as a commissioner to think about as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's not something that we've considered or discussed previously.
Yeah, if somebody is in need of some assistance in terms of triage and the specialist skills of those triage nurses in the control room, absolutely. We
absolutely. So in those circumstances, the firefighter could have called perhaps the control room and said, right, you know, we need some support here.
Absolutely. And I think the more we move towards multi-agency partnership wraparound as a service, that person will be supported by the correct person that can deliver the correct service to them at first point of contact. Whereas at the moment, I think they come into contact with lots of other services that might not be the right service to resolve their core underlying issues or concerns, and it takes a long time for them to get to that correct agency, and we could do that at point of first contact if we read across.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next slide, this builds on much of what we've just spoken about there. This is our home safety overview and business safety overview. Unfortunately, some data missing here, back to the previous comments made about our capacity at the moment. But it's interesting to see that we've had an improvement this month at Scarborough, York and Selby in terms of outputs from some of the whole-time staff there. So there's a lot more activity now beginning to happen there. And similarly in the business safety overview, the outputs of the whole-time crews, they're now beginning to bear fruit. Um,
Could I just ask on the fire safety audit? So Hambleton and Rydale seem to have, and naturally probably a lower level
Yeah.
of audits because they're not urban areas. But should we be concerned that those numbers are quite low, and can they get support from full-time staff who could come out of area to support?
Yeah. So both those areas are they do have a whole-time capability there, but
Right.
you're quite right in that it's not to the same level and scale as what we have in York, Scarborough and Harrogate. The business safety side of things we've been covering. Previously we had a theme which was running on houses in multiple occupation, and there tends to be more in the urban areas than there do in the rural areas. The next theme is now, which we moved on to, is licensed premises, and so we should see a shift there going forward, but it won't be at the scale that we see in the more urban areas. Again, there's more licensed premises within those areas. We are reviewing our business safety arrangements so that we can make sure that we're directing our resources to the more remote areas, which it takes longer for a response to attend.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure on both home fire safety and business safety that we've got those areas well covered, and we are reviewing that currently.
So for example, obviously somewhere like Hawes, which is covered very well by a very dedicated on-call crew, but obviously there's a business park there. Similarly in Thirsk and other places like that, do they get not special attention, but do they get some dedicated attention on a regular basis to make sure that they are audited and that safety is?
We try to focus our attention on the high risk and medium risk premises, but high risk is the predominant one, and that is where we have people sleeping. Some of the premises that we've just mentioned there may well have staff there working, but generally daytime hours, and there's no. So in terms of risk, we have to focus our attention on our high risk premises. But nonetheless, in terms of the audits, we have a responsibility to go and audit premises, and so we have teams that can go and support those areas where we don't have the whole time crew available to do it, and that's exactly what we do. Yeah.
And if any member of the public had any concerns about any property that they visited to shop or use, hotels or businesses, anything at all, if they had concerns about that, then we have got reporting mechanisms that they can report that concern into the fire safety team, and they will carry out an inspection on the back of that.
Moving on to the next slide. This is where we would normally have had some input on our appliance availability, and unfortunately I can't provide that slide this time, other than to say that our on-call availability is at 76% average for the month of October, and that is pre-operational staffing reserve cover moves. So if we had applied that, then we would see up in the 80% category, which we'd normally see. I do aim to get that information fixed in preparation for future public accountability meetings. The health and safety overview, no major concerns there on this slide at all, other than the cause for concern we've had a spike back up again, not a huge amount, but in October we were at 11 where we had 6 the previous month, and again this is largely due to the ongoing issues that we've had with our mobile data terminals. We are getting to the end of some of the problems that we've experienced here, but it has been quite a difficult period implementing those new devices onto the appliances, and we've come across with teething problems, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we're working again with the team within Enable to overcome these issues as best we can now. So we'll monitor that going forward. And then the final slide is the absence level overview, and again no major concerns on this slide this month. We did have a query on the long-term sickness for on-call stations, as there are a number of them which were at 31 days, but when we've confirmed that, it is because there's been an individual off for the whole of the month on a number of stations, so the figures were correct. happy to take any questions.
None from me. Julia, do you have any further questions on
No.
any of those?
No.
In that case, thank you very much, John. Let's move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I'll get this right to start with. There we go. Okay, well, so we'll start on the mental health slide. All the data I'm going to give you is largely down to separate months or the year-to-date figure so far. But in terms of mental health, as you'll notice, for the past 5 months, there has been significant increases, but this has been down to increased tagging of incidents essentially onto the computer system when appropriate, which is allowing a better, more tailored approach. So I would foresee now over the next few months that will be the mean average in terms of you shouldn't see any significant rises or falls. We're actually seeing what the reality is. However, continued work needs to be ongoing in terms of increasing the number of mental health tags, because we've seen historically that we don't sometimes place the tags on specific incidents when we should do.
And I think it's fair to say that it's not a bad thing to see that we're actually recording it better. There was obviously the National Day of Action around recording mental health.
Yeah.
Is there any reflection, on the outcomes of that? I know that the data is still kind of waiting, but because it was a concerted effort to make sure that we were recording.
Nothing has been fed back to me, but certainly in terms of the awareness in force of doing it, that most definitely was there, and this is something that we must get right and we must continue with. So as soon as we do get those figures, they'll be reported back accordingly.
Great.
Just moving on to the middle table there, you'll see this percentage split of the type of incidents. At the top still again is concern for safety, which is the highest proportion of a mental health incident. At the bottom, you'll notice in October there was one individual who was detained in police custody, having from a mental health point of view. However, that individual was originally arrested for a substantive offence, assessed whilst in custody, and it was not safe to take them to a health-based place of safety. To that person, for their own safety and those others in the health establishments, it was better to keep them under constant supervision, etc., within our custody suite.
So we understand the reason why this table's changed slightly, because obviously public viewers who may have seen it last month will notice that there are a number of zeros at the bottom there rather than threes, twos and ones. We understand the reason for that, and in terms of recording the statutory outliers, that's very worthwhile. We would quite like to see the other numbers as well, so those where the identification happened after they've been taken to custody. The impact essentially is the same on any individual, isn't it, if they've been taken in the cage van. And I guess from our perspective, now knowing that information, is what are the reasons why that person hasn't been identified before they were taken to custody? What was it about them being in custody there where that extra information? Was it an L&D assessment, a liaison and diversion, a health assessment essentially? Was it that the custody sergeant has received better training?
Yep.
Okay.
Are there reasons around it? I think that we'd like to know.
So are you thanks, Tom. Are you referring to the Home Office and HMIC FRS way of recording?
So that table, we understand, shows the statutory outliers, because there is now legislation around the fact that people can't be taken to custody if they've been sectioned under the Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. So we understand that table is now showing only those where those statutory outliers have those infringements have taken place. Previously, therefore, we were also seeing the individuals who had been arrested and taken to custody, who had then been identified as having a sectionable mental health illness, and had then been sectioned and removed to a place of safety, a health-based place of safety after that point. And our concern, I guess, is that why were those people identified prior to being taken to custody and then taken straight to a health-based place of safety, appropriate Section 136 suite, rather than to custody first? Very good to know that they have then been identified and taken to the appropriate place. But we'd just like to maintain a monitor on where that actually has happened. So like to see the statutory infringements, but also the times when.
Has this been picked up before with the Nexus team, the team who compile that information, or is this the first time?
No, so this is just arisen today because we were reviewing those figures and very worth understand the rationale there, but would like to see the others as well. So if we can take that forward for next time, so that we can get both sets.
No, that's great. I just asked because I've been informed that there has been a way of a change in the way that they're gathering the data, but that's separate to what you're saying. So I'll take that away and I'll speak to the team around that. No, that's brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the section 136 slides. You'll note at the top average officers per incident is still at 5.31, and 761 minutes is the average per occurrence. Now this has now gone over 14 hours per officer for dealing with anything relating to section 136. If somebody is taken under 136 Mental Health Act to Darlington, that's up to about 19 hours now. So it depends where we are in the county and where we're going to be taking people. Significant amounts of time, and you can imagine that necessarily isn't normally one officer taking 19 hours because they don't work that long normally. It wouldn't be appropriate, but there'll be 2 officers, potentially 3 officers, potentially 4 officers on those types of incidents.
Total hours.
Absolutely, which is where you see your average is 5.31. Some people might turn up for 10 minutes, but some people might be with that individual for 10 hours. So that's something that we need to continue to look at.
And that's a reflection. So Commissioner is currently doing quite a bit of work through the Mental Health Crisis Care Command, obviously, around this, and certainly the data that we've gained from the National Action Day, and we actually extended it to a week, didn't we, will be really useful in assessing that, because I understand that if they go to Middlesbrough, for example, it's actually a much shorter period of time because there's a much easier access to the suite there. And so it's very much about the facilities that are being provided to support that, isn't it? So we will certainly take that forward.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Tom, can I?
Yes. Go on, Julian.
Yeah. So what I think we really need is now that we've got the sort of that day of action or week of action data. I think we need to do a proper analysis and report that we can take to the Concord Act, linked in with the work of the Concord Act, because I think we keep, for the first time, we'll have some proper robust data, and we've never had that before, and I think it's really important that partners see that.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
particularly around the usage of the places of safety, given that is set to change.
Yeah.
So we need, because they can't assess their demand. So perhaps we need to help them.
Yeah. No, that's fine. So, and I know that Dan is pulling a full kind of data set together for that. So I'll touch base with Natasha and look at how we take that forward. So excellent, Kate as well.
Thank you. Moving on then to overall force incidents, you'll see that we in the month of October just had just over 7,000 incidents with just under 4,000 crimes. That's what we would expect around this around a normal October, if you can ever have a normal October in policing. Just the split in terms of across the command areas then, for the City Command, York and Selby, around 2,700 incidents. Guildhall being, as it usually is, the largest contributor to that. For the coast, 1,694. Obviously, seasonality wise, normally it's quite close to York at certain points of the year, but in October you see a big drop off, as we normally do in terms of coastal demand. However, there's still 948 crimes across there, with Castle again being the main contributor to that. For the County Command, 1,382 crimes. County still with less average minutes per incident for their officers dealing with incidents there, and Lower Harrogate being the highest contributor for volume of crime. Moving on to the next slide then, just a couple of points here. You'll see increases of 25% for miscellaneous crimes against society. This is largely forgery And then threat to commit criminal damage. There's been an influx in that in the month of October. Public order offences, Section 4 and Section 5, so there's a 32.5% increase in public order offences linked largely to the nighttime economy. And just at the bottom, there is a 10% increase in violence against the person. This is largely down to a spike in malicious communications and assault without injury. But there are some generic reductions across the board, which is what we'd expect to see. Any comments on any of those?
Not on that. We've got some coming up, so
Okay, so
we could
I'll skip
potentially
through quickly then, should I? From the crime focus point of view, just looking at Hambleton and Richmondshire, drug offences up 40%, a lot of proactivity ongoing there, and violence offences again up almost 20% in Hambleton and Richmondshire. Similar figures across in Craven in terms of violence offences across there, up 22% as well, and again across in the Harrogate area, up 14%, up 10% in Scarborough for violence, and up nearly 10% in Selby. As I've mentioned, a lot of those are down to violence without injury.
So we had a brief discussion last time around the difference between Hamilton and Richmondshire. I believe it's mainly Richmondshire when we actually look at the breakdown of that in terms of drug offences and the drug offences across the rest of the county. And one of the reasons that was brought forward was, compared to last year, obviously we're finding more of it and doing more about it, which is great. There's obviously a general concern at the moment that actually drugs are on the increase across the board as it is. There's the issue here around the fact that when we're talking about drug offences, those are ones which have actually been crimed and not just reports which have been taken as intelligence and recorded as such. Is there a way in which we can understand better through these slides, do you think, the actual kind of levels of reporting of drug-related concerns? Because we know from the public that it is on the up and on the up and on the up. Obviously there was the summit recently where we came together to talk about that. But we'd like to be able to keep a kind of focus on it and demonstrate to the public that we are actually understanding their concerns effectively. So
Are you talking about either a thematic at another public accountability, or are you talking about expanding on the slides to focus more on the drugs element?
I think we're probably looking at whether within these slides we can have a bit of a focus. In the same way that we did with burglary a couple of weeks ago, we had a couple of specific dedicated slides on burglary.
So what this looks, so in terms of it might look like the different types of possessions for the different types of class of drugs.
Yeah.
Or if we're talking about when we're doing activity with organised criminal gangs and we're taking large quantities. So you want just a little bit of a picture so the public can see, well, what are we doing? Are we taking cannabis off young people in the streets, or are we actually hitting some of the high-level dealers and taking large amounts for either premises or the road network?
Yeah, potentially. I think, but less potentially less around the narrative and more around actually understanding what is coming in. So what is coming in, and we are recording as intelligence and working from it, but there isn't an actual offence, because all we ever see is the ones where we've actually crimed something under the relatively specific drug offences categories, and so that we can see the kind of breakdown and demonstrate to the public the volume of what we're actually looking at and what we're actually acting on.
I mean, absolutely. I think that the public will be aware through just the national media attention over the last couple of years around the county line side of things, and obviously in North Yorkshire we have put more resource and much more focus and attention looking at county lines. That might not necessarily be the issue in Richmondshire though. So the public, I think, need to sort of understand that in terms of not necessarily where all the lines are within the county, but exactly what does a drug problem look like in the Richmondshire area. Yeah. So no, that's absolutely fine. What I'll do is I will speak to the team around that to look at what we can do to give offering some more detail
Okay.
for the public's point of view.
That's fine. And if we can have that discussion a bit further and
Yeah,
bring
let's-
those
let's
slides
take it
back for
outside, yeah,
January,
and
that would be good. Julia, does that kind of cover the kind of things that we were wanting to look at more specifically around drugs? Does that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole issue of county lines has been covered quite comprehensively. My wider, I've got a wider concern about other types of drugs and the availability of them, and whether or not we've actually got a really good picture of that. And I am certainly from the Drugs Summit, we have a lot of questions around that, really.
So the intelligence analysts might be able to assist.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you basically want a richer picture, don't you, of as opposed to the basic drug dealing reports, it's the wider hidden drug issues that are going on in the community that are potentially reported, but not, they don't flag up on there, do they?
Exactly. On a month-by-month basis, we get these figures and they show that
They're
drug offences are going down,
Yeah.
and yet the public are sitting there saying to us, well, that's just rubbish. You know, we're seeing more and more of it on the street corners
Yeah.
and so on. So if we can have just a few slides to really show a slightly more detailed picture around what are we actually getting in terms of drug reports and people reporting about drugs.
So basically, a thematic,
Performance slides,
it's a thematic intelligence picture, isn't it? Really, as opposed to.
If I'm a member of the public watching and listening to this, and as a parent of teenage girls and teenage kids, I'd be thinking. My concern would be is what's the drug activity among the young people in the area where so I get what I think where you're getting at. So for me, I'd want to understand what the young people doing, what they're using, where they're getting it from. Is it a big issue in particular areas? We've already had the tragic death of the 15-year-old girl this year this year in Northallerton.
Yeah.
Can't have any more of that. But drug use is rife in areas with young people in certain areas of North Yorkshire.
Yeah.
So it's about getting in from the intelligence side of things, but we know that those young people are from hard to reach groups. We know that there's intelligence out there that we potentially don't get.
Yeah.
So that I agree, let's have a look at that and see what we need to do.
And I think it's only going to be another 2 or 3 slides to add to this performance pack
Yeah.
for January. But if we could
Okay.
look at doing that, that'd be good. Julia, did you have something else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they are necessarily hard to reach groups. Some of these children. I mean, I think there's a lot of, mainstream recreational drug taking going on, and I think the difficulty is that it's dealt on platforms like Snapchat and those sorts of things, which are very difficult to see. So there's the visible stuff that communities see, the things going on in driveways and all of the rest of it, but there's all the online activity as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Good stuff. Just moving on then, so around ASB, public safety, welfare and KSIs, some good reductions really across the board in terms of antisocial behaviour, and we're talking about the period April to October here, but every area is seeing a reduction. In terms of KSIs, slight increase in Hambleton and Richmondshire, but a good decrease of 30% in Craven, and some other things we've done jointly with Fire Service and Yorkshire Ambulance and Air Ambulance this month was hold the Oakleaf event hosted by North Yorkshire Police at Ripon Cathedral, which I attended with Carl Boseman from Fire and some colleagues from Air Ambulance and the paramedics, and that was for the families of those killed on the roads this year for to come and remember their loved ones, and that was a really poignant event and something that we continue to do. And having spoken to a lot of the families that were there, they were absolutely over the moon that we held that event, and it was really good for them to come together and actually talk to each other as different families. Some recently lost their loved ones just in July this year. Coroner's outcome isn't there, but they're able to talk to other families to know what to expect. So that was a really good thing we did around KSIs this month as a joint partnership.
2 things that we'd like to pick up just from this slide quickly. So antisocial behaviour, we've talked about this on a couple of occasions previously. We've done a bit more analysis around this, and it's very clear now that it is largely down to the recording of crimes rather than
like ASB.
So people are reporting something which they think is ASB, and the police are recording it as crime, which is excellent, very good news. However, it does mean the picture that we're still getting from the public is very different. There are still a lot of concerns around ASB.
Yeah.
I've actually discussed this with Phil briefly to see whether there's a way in which we can add a qualifier, go above and beyond the Home Office kind of recording, so that where there is something which is reported as a concern around ASB, but then there is a crime as well, rather than essentially re-recording it as the crime and cancelling the ASB element to it, and therefore losing the ASB.
Yeah, you're talking about opening codes and closing codes, yeah.
Yeah, so we've looked at the opening and closing codes, and there are a significant number of those that have been opened as ASB which are now being closed as an actual crime, which is great. It's being recorded properly. It's better for the person affected, because especially in ASB personal cases where they've been directly impacted. But I think if the public looking at that picture also wouldn't necessarily recognise. I mean, it's really good to know that there is this change in ASB, but I don't think the public would recognise it in the same way. And whether there's a way in which we can gain a better picture of incidents where there is a concern around antisocial behaviour and it has actually been crimed more appropriately. But the fact that so if you take criminal damage for example, there's a difference between somebody going somewhere and causing criminal damage because they've gone there with the intent of causing criminal damage, and a group of young people who've been playing football outside of a shop or something,
and they recklessly cause criminal damage, which is also a criminal offence.
Well, yes, exactly.
But the member of the public doesn't see it like that.
Well, yes, and both of them are recorded as criminal damage,
Absolutely.
albeit one with their slightly different categories. But there's a very clear antisocial behaviour aspect to the latter, which we're losing sight of potentially, just at this face level. So trying to see whether there's a way in which we can reflect that in how.
I tend to, if the public are looking at this, they'll see a generic, there's a reduction. But those people who are suffering continual antisocial behaviour should have a wraparound, or will have a wraparound from our neighbourhood policing teams.
Yes.
Because I get exactly what you're saying. You're talking about kids initially building up and particularly hanging out on a street corner or on a cycle path near residential premises. But it escalates and escalates and escalates, and if you don't deal with that, then you'll just get the crime. And are we just focusing on dealing with the crime? Well, the answer to that is no, we're not just focusing on dealing with the crime. We're looking at dealing with the escalation of that, because this person and the people who ring us a lot and the repeat callers are the people that we need to target in terms of looking after and helping. So we do have, the neighbourhood policing teams will be looking at those individuals from that point of view, but it doesn't help if you're told, well, is it antisocial behaviour in North Yorkshire's reducing if you're continually getting these issues. The point is we need to nip these issues in the bud, tackle the actual people who are causing the antisocial behaviour, and make sure we get the resolution for that member of the public.
Definitely, and just as a reflection, all the anecdotal evidence we've kind of gathered is showing that neighbourhood policing teams are taking a much tougher stance on this, which is really good news, and especially for those who are suffering from antisocial behaviour. I think they appreciate the fact that it's been recognised, more seriously as a crime. What we aren't seeing, though, for example, is a reflection of that in the number of cases going to the Youth Outcomes Panel. So Youth Outcomes Panel deals with crimes associated with young people. Their number of cases hasn't gone up. So we're recording it as a crime, but are we actually following that through in any particular way? And are we leaving it as a crime and not following up with the antisocial aspect to it, if you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we're just wondering if we can find a way to kind of reflect that better in these statistics and keep a better focus on it, I guess.
Should we have that discussion
We
as well
can have
outside?
discussion,
Because there's merit in it.
And then the second aspect of this is the domestic incidents.
Yeah.
Julie, do you want to pick up on this in terms of the data that's been released today, or do you want me to?
Yeah, fine. So the interesting, Sorry. So, the interesting thing is are the reductions here, and if you contrast that with national data, which just happens to have been released today, what you've got is a significant increase in domestic incidents. And so we are completely at odds with the national data, and I just wanted to see if we had any idea why.
Is this the and it's the context, isn't it, that matters? Is if something is not recorded as a crime, it gets put down as a domestic incident, or do these include the crimes? Would be my first question.
Yeah.
In terms of understanding the data, because
Right.
if what we're saying is we're recording more criminal domestic violence, and therefore the number of incidents that remain as incidents are going down,
Yep.
you'd probably expect to see that if you're converting more incidents into crimes.
Yep.
But if these include the crimes, then it absolutely doesn't look right in terms of the national trend and the direction of travel where we want to encourage people to report. So I think we need to understand what's included in the figures.
We do, because these are incidents, these aren't the crimes. So a domestic incident will be closed as a domestic incident, but you might have stalking and harassment within there. You might have a Section 39 assault, a Section 47 assault, and the criminal damage attached to that. So domestic related crime, and it depends whether it's domestic related crime or whether it's just domestic incidents, because a domestic is not a crime.
No.
It's the others.
But a crime of violence against a person
Yeah.
would have a qualifier
For
of a domestic,
Yep.
wouldn't it?
Yep.
So the question is whether
Does this include
all
that
these
or not?
domestic incidents, yes, exactly. So if something gets a domestic qualifier, does it come in these stats?
And if we then crime it, it gets taken out of these stats,
Okay.
and the figure appears on the crime stats and not as
But it
be
should
left
have,
as a
it
domestic
should still have a
incident.
qualifier.
It would, but it would go on the data return to the Home Office as a crime,
Right.
Right. So
I think-
so I think
as an
that's where.
assault or a damage or a whatever.
This
I
could be
think-
easily sorted.
Yes, we need to know.
Comparison.
You're absolutely right, Julia, but we need to ask, don't we? Does this include when a crime is converted from that domestic incident log or not?
But also, I think it potentially gives an entirely incorrect impression, which is substantiated by the comment in the box, is that we're seeing a reduction in domestic incidents. When I don't think that is the case. I think we're seeing domestic. We don't know what's happening to domestic incidents actually. And actually, if some of them are then going to be identified as crimes, we're then not tracking accurately the status, if you like, of domestic incidents in the county. And you know, I'm also concerned around things like sort of coercive control and those types of activities as well. We know we've got some challenges around stalking in particular, and it just sits really uncomfortably with me. These particularly the comment that we're seeing a long-term reduction in domestic incidents. I'm not convinced by that at all.
And if they're being converted into crimes, it needs to say that what remains as domestic incident, the reason it's coming down is because there's a higher percentage of those incidents being converted into crimes and counted as crimes, if that's what it's showing.
Yes.
Exactly.
I think, however, what we would like to see on this slide potentially is, even if they're converted into crimes,
You want to see the
we
figures.
want to see the qualifier.
Well, you'd want to see, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And of those domestic incidents, how many of them?
Have been crimes.
Yes, so you can
potentially,
add the two
for
together.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say these are comparisons over that period over the last 3 years, but we need to see the data behind what it's saying. Yeah, I get that.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Proactivity-wise, quickly go through this one. In terms
Stop
of
the
your
television going off.
firearms support units, large proportion of their time around organised acquisitive crime, and then almost half up to around drugs production and supply. Your operational support unit, again, focusing on organised acquisitive crime. And your road policing, as no surprise, is 65% on road traffic collisions, and then a good proportion of 28% working alongside their colleagues in FSU and OSU, looking at organised acquisitive crime.
We quite excited. We have just received from the ONS a full breakdown of all postcodes by their classification of rurality.
Very good.
And rural. which I'm just about to share with Mark properly. We would be really keen to see a breakdown of especially these proactivity stats by that rural urban postcode breakdown, please. Especially of interest is around organised inquisitive crime. Maybe for obvious reasons at this particular moment in time, but we'd really like to see that, and see what the focus is and where they're actually spending the majority of their time on these different things. That would be really interesting to see. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I also think that then that needs to be looked at per head of population as well, so that you can get a sense of the scale of it proportionate to the numbers of people, because I think that would be quite interesting. And also, if you look at the roads policing data there, there's quite a lot, about a third of the time of the roads team being taken up on this, which is obviously right, but that would suggest that they are travelling criminals.
Yeah.
And also this would then also feed into the research that the National Rural Crime Network is doing around organised crime in rural areas, and it might be able to provide us with quite an interesting data set that we could use in other areas.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, we'll have that discussion with Mark outside of here.
That's great, thank you.
There would normally be a rural task force briefing in here, but that's due to a changeover of inspector and tight timescales, I haven't unfortunately been able to do a report, but it'll be ready for the next meeting. Just moving on then, finally to, or almost finally to the FCR. So we've seen highest volumes in terms of 999 calls, your emergency calls, highest October volumes since 2010. Almost a 10% increase since October 2018, and we know over the last few years it's been continually going up and up. 2% national decrease since September 2019, and almost a 6% national increase since October 2018. Obviously we're still tracking the number of 999 calls that we miss and have to get the second time around, so that's obviously some focus around that.
Okay, can we just recognise the fact that we're dipping below 60% answered within 10 seconds there, at the same time, and appreciating the increases. A lot of work has obviously gone into the FCR over recent years and months to try and not be in this situation. Obviously, very good work going on in the force control room by the call handlers, but can we just recognise that as well?
Yeah. Thanks. And just in relation to your 101 calls, almost a 4% decrease in September 2019 and a 15% decrease since this time last year. Average handling time is 8 minutes and 15 seconds. And National 101 volumes for October are not yet available. Questions on 101?
Well, I've had the opportunity of calling 101 recently for an incident, and I have to say, I mean, the callback facility was excellent.
Great. I don't know. I'm going to take that as a compliment. So.
No, it was. I've had quite a lot of interaction with 101 recently as a consequence of something that happened, and I have to say that it has been okay. There's obviously been a wait, but the callback facility has worked really, really well.
Good. Excellent, thank you, Commissioner. Good stuff. And just the last slide on here just shows burglary and road-related and mental health-related, and some of the differences there. I wasn't going to highlight any particular area because we've covered quite a lot already in particular to those subjects, unless there's anything anyone wants to discuss.
No, I think the only thought for us is it's interesting when we get this breakdown by actual district, because the Hamilton-Richmondshire data that we saw a couple of slides ago, obviously it's very clear that there's a big difference between what's happening in Richmondshire and what's happening in Hamilton. We wonder, and again, I imagine that some of the explanation for those figures is that there's going to be more proactivity happening in Richmondshire, and more going out and tackling these issues and so on and so forth. I guess the question is there anything that other areas might be able to learn from what they're doing? Are we looking at exactly what how their neighbourhood teams are being tasked? And
and I mean obviously we're talking percentage differences, so we're talking, you know, it was 16 in the same period last year to 35 this, but in a small area that can have a big impact on that community. So something we'll look at, and it's something we should be able to get a quick turnaround for you in terms of what that looks like. It may be in the next PAM that it's back down to where it was, and this was a spike in relation to focusing on some particular locations and particular individuals and particular activity.
Yeah,
but you're right, it doesn't look like that on the other slide. Okay, and then moving on then to the people side of things. There's lots of data on here, but I'll just move on to the last bit really. Unless there's any other major questions, there isn't anything of note in terms of anything out of the ordinary in terms of absence, sickness related, etc. On the previous slide, psychological is almost 8%, physical 92%. So obviously we're starting to see some changes in the type and reason why people are off sick. There's mention of lots of initiatives that are ongoing. What I would say in general, in terms of certainly the policing family and keeping people at work, is that we need to make sure we continue to look after people after they have attended traumatic incidents. We've had several this month, and it's the same from the fire, because I was speaking to Carl from fire the other day, of people attending tragic incidents and then making sure we have the right referrals, trim referrals, anything around the wraparound about that well-being of that individual. We need to keep going with that to keep people at work and keep, you know, their mental well-being in the place it needs to be to come to work every day.
And interestingly enough, Mike, that's one of the areas being covered on the Joint Leadership Day next month. Brilliant. From both fire and police, is how we deal with people around traumatic incidents.
Absolutely. And just looking at this, North Yorkshire Police has got an 8.27% public sector.
I think it's days.
Days lost, sorry, not percent, days lost. Public sector is at 8.4. And the private sector is 4.4, so an average of 5.9. So the days lost has not had a massive fluctuation, certainly for us from the police's point of view in the last few months.
Have you looked at yet at how that compares with other police forces across the country? Because I think that one of the reasons why we wanted, in particular for the police to see this, was that we were concerned we might be heading towards the top end of nationally significant levels of absence. So potentially, if we could,
will be a national chart.
There definitely is. Yes. So if for next time, which will be January now, we could.
You want the police national?
The police national picture, yes, please. Just to see how we compare on that front. That would be really useful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Julia, do you have anything else that you'd like to?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Right. Well, thank you very much. Actually, on time this time round. Only one presentation, of course, so that's probably helped. But thank you very much to everybody here. Thank you to Julia on the phone. Thank you to members of the public. Simon, do we have any final questions?
No.
Wonderful. Right, excellent. Well, thank you very much. You can always contact the Office of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner if you do have any questions on the back of this. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just done.
Tom, thank you for standing in.